The next decision bias we're going to talk about is the anchoring bias. And what we mean by the anchoring bias is when we are given information, we typically anchor to the information that's provided to us first. This is part of a starting point, and then we don't vary from that. So the power of suggestion that if I say, oh, I think 10% of the people do XYZ, most of the time people will go, well, I kind of disagree with 10%, but maybe it's more like 20. Versus if they were to look at a situation and really analyze it for themselves, they might actually see that it might be more like 50 or 60%. And what happens is, once we get anchored to that, it is difficult for us to vary from it unless we are very intentional and mindful about it. And we see this in a lot of different things. For example, when we get to the section on decision making in groups, you're going to hear me talk about consultative decision making in a group where the leader comes in, consults with the group, and they provide information to the leader about what they recommend. It's a consultative approach. Ultimately, the decision is still the leader's decision to make. The challenge is for many leaders, though, they walk into those rooms and they say, here's the problem. Here's what I think we should do. What do you think? And because there's an anchoring bias attached to that, the followers aren't really going to vary from the idea that the leader anchored them in the first place for a whole host of reasons. Number one, because they've been mentally anchored to it to start with. But number two, also because no one wants to challenge the CEO or the leader in the room. They want to go along to get along. And so I always recommend to leaders, when you are working with a group and you want the group to do the problem solving for you, don't tell them what you think the solution should be. Tell them what the issue is, tell them some basic facts, encourage them to do their own research, and then let them come back with recommendations, because this way it's not biased. Where do we also see this? Well, when it comes to estimates on prices, look at people with Price is Right. If you've ever watched that TV show, you can see how people get anchored to a certain price, particularly when they are estimating in the very first round, where in order to get on the stage, they have to be able to estimate what the price is. First person who goes anchors the price, and everybody then makes estimates based on what that initial person talks about. That's an anchoring bias. And it's rare that you see somebody vary from that. So once we set our starting point, we fail to adjust it when we're given additional information. So when it becomes a bias when we have additional information that says maybe it's a little bit further away from this estimate than we thought. But if we still continue to double down and believe that it's closer to that initial estimate, then we are very prone to that decision-making bias. It can become really purposeful or really apparent when there is a lack of what we call objective information to compare something against. For example, in the real estate crisis and the stock market crisis in the late 2000s, people started valuing a thing called a credit default swap. A credit default swap doesn't have an inherent value. There is no inherent value to it, not like the dollar or not like a coin or something that we know has a long history of a value to it, like rare gems or things like that. So we didn't have a value. Someone said, maybe we should just charge this, or maybe we should value it as being worth X amount of dollars. And then once we start and anchor that, people stayed stuck to that initial value, and everything sort of went up or down from there. So was that what the value of a credit default swap was? We don't know, because we don't know what the inherent value of a credit default swap is. But we did see a lot of anchoring bias in people that didn't want to vary from what those initial interpretations were. For those people who said those credit default swaps don't really have a lot of value, why would I spend money for them? They they were ignored. For the people who believed this was this amazing money market opportunity, and then of course the values of those credit default swaps would go sky high with no meaningful value underneath them. The other situation that we should be aware of is when things are really ambiguous, when things are unclear. Be really careful and cautious when trivial information starts getting thrown at you. You have to decide what is meaningful and what is trivial, because if it's trivial information, we don't want to be using it at all. In terms of selective perception, let me take you back to that first lecture where we were talking about the perceptual process, how we perceive information, how we make sense of information. And when it comes to selective perceptions, we pay less attention to the stimulus itself and the information um, that we get from the stimulus, and pay far more attention to our attitudes, interests, experiences, and background, our own individual characteristics. And because of our past experience, we assume that the stimulus is very similar to something that we experienced in our past. But when we're not paying enough attention to the stimulus, we don't recognize that it might not be in alignment with some of our past experience. So it might actually be something brand new that we need to pay attention to. So it is important that we pay attention to the stimulus, that we don't knee jerk react right away when it comes to something, that we go deeper and we recognize where our own personal bias might come into play when it comes to something, and differentiate between that and what is actually going on. I've often had experiences with people where they'd said to me, "You're doing X." And I'm like, "No, that's actually not what I did. You're interpreting it based on your own past experiences, but that's actually not what I've done, because it's pretty clear what I've said to you is not, it has nothing to do with the past experiences that you had." But it's very challenging to be with someone who is so stuck in their past history that they are unwilling or unable to see a situation for what it is more objectively. So it is important. I do it myself. Don't get me wrong. I'm not sort of pointing my finger at somebody else here. I recognize that I do this myself, where I am far more likely to interpret something based on my own past experiences, even if the situation is very different than what I experienced in the first place. We're all prone to these things. So again, mindfulness, asking ourselves to slow down, to take a look at the situation, to try to see the world through the other person's eyes, will be the best way for us to avoid problems with selective perception. And we will be more embracing of the experience for what it is rather than stuck in our interpretation of it. And now we come to confirmation bias. And confirmation bias, as I've already said, is is the process of gathering information where we ignore the information that we don't want to hear or does not confirm or reinforce our point of view, and we focus on only the things that reinforce what we believe in and what we believe should be correct, because we're not leading with presumptions and information, we're leading with our opinions, which often can be very biased. We don't sub, sorry, let me correct that. We don't objectively gather data, we subjectively gather it. We go after things that reinforce what we want to know. As we get into mindfulness, discussion about mindfulness and decisions under uncertainty, confirmation bias is one of the biggest problems that we face when we're making decisions under uncertainty. So it's important that we gather and seek out disconfirming information. Now, what if there's no disconfirming information to be found? Awesome. Then really we have more evidence that supports that, yes, we're correct. But the goal really should be that we are looking for things that prove us wrong, because then we can say truthfully that we've done a thorough search and that we've balanced all the evidence for and all the evidence against, and we're coming up with a conclusion that we believe is right as we're seeking information. but we subjectively gather it because we want consistency. We want a world that's consistent, that fits within our worldview, that fits in the little box that our brain is organizing for us. And then the more that we gather confirming evidence, the more it reinforces how we feel about things. So we have to be careful of not getting overly excited and allowing the adrenaline rush of getting the confirming evidence, or the dopamine rush of getting that confirming evidence, to stop us from still gathering information that might prove us wrong. And again, because our brain is seeking simple solutions with little interference and little conflict, this is an easy thing that can happen to any one of us when we're doing any kind of research. So I absolutely encourage you, anytime you're doing research on anything, whether it's for school or you're doing it for your own personal information, it's not enough to just go after and look at information that says, see, I'm right. It's also about looking at and reading and analyzing things that say you might not be right. And here's another way of thinking about it. It is absolutely important that we do this. Our next three slides are going to be about the framing bias, and specifically how there's different ways that we can frame people to think about things in a certain way. When we think about a frame, it's like a photographer frames a picture. They are looking at it and they set it up in such a way that the attention goes to the thing that they want you to see and to interpret, to ignore everything else around it. So frames can be obviously a physical thing like a photo frame, but really what we're talking about is mental frames, and suggestions about what the argument is. And often it can be set up as you can choose A or you can choose B. So someone is framing the argument for you that the only choices you have are A or B. But invariably, we have many more choices than just A or B. It's not always a dichotomous on or off switch, but it's an entire continuum of things that we can do to solve a problem. So anytime someone says to you, well, you can choose, this or that, that's what you got to offer, you can come back and say, I'm going to be more creative. I'm going to think outside the box. And I don't believe that it's just A or B. I think it can be more than that. It can be different than that, or it can be anywhere in between the two. So we frame based on our experiences, our training, our culture. Marketing is, executives are the masters of framing things because they understand decision bias, they understand perceptions, and they understand that when we frame an argument in a way that encourages people to do something or discourages them from doing something, that this is the goal of marketing, right? We want them to buy something and we don't want them to do something else. So we frame the situation to keep their attention on the issue that matters, and then we go ahead and encourage people to do that behavior, whatever it is. And most of the time, we fall victim to those framing biases. So we have to also remember, and this has a lot to do with Kahneman and Tversky's work on how we react to gains versus losses. When we believe that we could potentially lose something that we already have, for example, that we might have to lay off employees or something along that line, we want to be as risk averse as possible. So we want to do everything we can so that we don't have to engage in a layoff to let people go. Or we might do everything we can not to lose money that we invested in something. So let's say you got an inheritance from your great aunt, Carol, and you take that inheritance and you're like, wow, this is a nice inheritance, and I'm never going to get another lump sum like this money. So I want to put it in a risk averse investment because I don't want to lose that money at all. So I will engage in risk averse behaviors so that I don't lose what I already have or lose something that I want to keep. On the other hand, our risk-taking propensity completely shifts when the situation is we could gain something that we don't already have. So let's say I have $1,000 that I know I'm going to invest. And if I believe that there's a tremendous gain that I could win, I could make like $10,000 with that $1,000 that I have. If I only invested in this one thing, I am more likely to take a risk, particularly if I don't think that that $1,000 is meaningful to me. If that $1,000 is meaningful to you, then you'll be risk averse. But if keeping that $1,000 is really meaningful to you, um, is not as meaningful to you, then you're much more likely to take risky behaviors to gain things that you didn't already have. So let's say I want to do whatever it takes to keep my employees versus losing my employees. You're framing things in a slightly different way, even though they both are same sides of the same coin. By saying you want to keep this or saying that you don't want to lose this frames the way we think about it. So when I want to say I want to keep something, um, and I'm when I want to keep something, I'm more likely to perceive it as something as a potential loss and a risk averse. On the other hand, the other perspective is I'm going to do whatever it takes to make sure I can keep I don't lose what I have or keep what I have. It can get very complicated, as you can already hear from my struggling with trying to explain this. It's very challenging for people to think about how we perceive losses and potential losses and how we treat gains or potential gains. So you could keep people if you do this, then I'm going to be more risk taking. I want to do whatever it can to keep the people, but I'm not going to do anything where I might risk losing people. And so it seems like it's a weird framing, and you might think I would never fall for that, but yet we do time and time again. When somebody frames an argument for us in a way as a gain or a loss, they're trying to encourage us to behave in a particular way. And particularly if they want to say, but if you do this, you could gain all these really good opportunities that you didn't have before. And we're much more likely to go, oh, I'll take the risk because I'm willing to try to get that thing. So it is important that we keep in mind, how is the person framing it? Are they framing it as a potential loss? Are they framing it as a potential gain? And if it's about keeping what I have, then I am going to be much more risk averse. If it's about getting something that I don't already have, then I'm absolutely going to be more risk taking in the process. So we've got a risky choice situation as the first example of a framing bias. And remember, if I could potentially lose something, even remotely, I am going to be risk averse. And if I am trying to gain something, I am going to be more risk taking. So let's look at the first options. A will save 200 people, and B has 1/3 of a chance of saving all 600, but 2/3 of a chance of saving no one. So that 2/3 of a chance is a huge weight on people. The possibility that they may not be able to save everybody, but they could save nobody in the choice that they make will push them to be risk averse. They're going to save 200 people no matter what, because the probability of saving all 600 seems very slim. You'll notice, though, that those options are indifferent. Because if you do a utility analysis of option B, a 1/3 chance of 600, a 2/3 chance of 0, it comes out to 200. So they're indifferent choices. But I'm going to frame it as you're going to save 200 people if you do this. I'm going to engage in A because I want to save 200 people guaranteed. Now, let's switch it up a little bit. Well, look at option C, which would allow 400 people to die. And D has a 1/3 chance no one would die and a 2/3 chance all 600 would die. So if I know for sure 400 people are going to die, absolutely, if I adopt this. Now again, it's the same as option A, either saving 200 or not saving 400. It's the exact same thing, but it's how it's framed, which is slightly different. So with C, would I allow 400 people to die? I don't think that I would. I would struggle with that. But if I have a 1/3 chance that no one would die, I am far more likely to take that chance. So I would be more risk seeking in this framing, which is framing D. So you have to think sort of deeply about this. It's really important you figure out, are they gaining something or are they losing something? Are they retaining something or are they potentially losing something? So once you determine what's being retained and what could be potentially gained, that helps you to figure out what the framing would be and to be careful of that risky choice. Because at the end of the day, those risky choices are indifferent to each other. The next one is what we call attribute framing. And again, when we go and buy beef or we go and buy chicken or we go and buy turkey and they'll say it's 75% lean, but we're far more likely to buy something that says it's 75% lean than we are to buy something that says it's 25% fat. So what we're doing in our attribute framing is we're focusing it on the thing that matters, which is I want people to buy this because it's leaner, versus focusing on a negative thing, which is this has fat in it and no one will want to buy that. So the framing is about looking for the positive attribute and encouraging people to buy the positive attribute, even if 25% lean, 25% fat and 75% lean are indifferent choices. But they're trying to frame it so that you like to buy the thing and you're more likely to buy it if it's 75% lean. The last framing we'll talk about is goal framing. And here's two ways of framing the goal, which is to get somebody to do a breast exam. Research shows that women who do breast exams have an increased chance of finding a tumor in the early, more treatable stages of the disease, compared to same basic idea, but an opposite framing. Research shows that women who do not do breast exams have a decreased chance of finding a tumor in the early, more treatable stages of the disease. When it comes to goal framing, I want to increase the likelihood I'm going to achieve a goal, not decrease the likelihood to avoid the goal, right? Or avoid losing the goal. So I'm far more likely to engage in something that's going to increase my chances of successfully achieving my goal of finding a tumor. So if you frame it as a positive thing for something to people to do, as opposed to a negative thing that they don't do, that will happen if they don't do it. Scare tactics don't work with people. And I don't know if any of you remember the old commercials that were on TV. I mean, ages ago it was, they held up an egg and they said, this is your brain. And they would crack the egg in a frying pan and they'd say, and this is your brain on drugs. Any questions? Now, people remember the commercials because it was a pretty profound, provocative commercial, but I'm not sure that it changed an addict's position on whether or not they would try drugs, right? Or use drugs for that matter. Um, and so if we really truly want people to do something positive, we have to do the research that, we have to show them that we're going to do the research that shows them that this would increase good outcomes, not decrease bad outcomes. So we always want to increase good outcomes and frame something as an increase in a good outcome.